He just wanted to grow a pumpkin in memory of his wife. But when the farmer cut open the huge fruit, he realized it was no ordinary plant. Something that shouldn't have existed began to grow in his field. See how it all ended? Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The mornings on Thomas Lane's farm had always started the same way, even after his wife's death. The sound of the old coffee pot sputtering on the stove, the distant hum of a tractor somewhere beyond the fields, and the smell of earth, dry, honest, and unchanging. But lately, that smell had begun to fade. The ground was tired. It no longer seemed to remember what it meant to bloom. He still woke before sunrise out of habit, sitting by the window with his coffee, watching the gray edge of the sky turn orange over the dying fields. The silence was heavier now. It filled the house the way his wife's laughter used to fill it. 3 years had passed since she was gone, and yet he still spoke to her sometimes, quietly, like one speaks to a photograph. Her name had been Linda. She had loved pumpkins. Every autumn, she'd turn their little plot of land into a carnival of color. Round orange fruits scattered across the brown soil like lanterns. Neighbors came to buy pies. Children came to pick the smallest ones. And Thomas, who never cared much for vegetables, learned to see beauty in their weight and warmth. When Linda died, he stopped planting them. The field went barren, covered in thistle and dust. But that spring, something in him shifted. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe the way the wind smelled after the rain. He decided he would plant pumpkins again, just once, for her. He spent 2 days clearing weeds, turning the soil, mending the sagging fence. The tractor sputtered and coughed like an old dog, but it worked. When he went to the local seed store, the clerk told him they were out of his favorite variety. That night, scrolling through a farming forum on his old laptop, he saw an advertisement that caught his eye. Autumn King XL, for those who dare to grow beyond limits. Heat-resistant, rapid growth, record size, private line, limited stock. The seller's username was simply ER. There was no photo, just a price that seemed almost too good to be true, and a note promising, a harvest you'll never forget. Thomas hesitated. He had never ordered seeds online before, but something about it, a mix of curiosity and nostalgia, pushed him to click buy. Maybe, he thought, this would be his small miracle. The package arrived a week later. It came in a plain gray envelope with no company name, only a smudged stamp that read, Hail Distribution. Inside was a small plastic pouch containing a handful of large, pale seeds. They weren't like any pumpkin seeds he'd seen before, smooth, metallic in color, as if brushed with silver dust. He ran them through his fingers and frowned. They felt faintly warm. He planted them the next morning, just after sunrise. The ground was soft from the night's drizzle, and the air smelled of cedar and wet dust. He set the seeds in neat rows, covered them gently, and stood back. For the first time in years, he felt a small flicker of hope. He whispered, half to himself, "This one's for you, Lynn." By the 3rd week, the seedlings had pushed through the soil. Most were small, shy, like any others. But one was different. Its leaves were darker, wider, and the veins glowed faintly when the sun hit them. It grew twice as fast as the rest, drinking water like a living sponge. Within a month, it had outgrown the others completely, its vines stretching across the bed, thick and muscular. Thomas built a wooden frame to keep it from sprawling over the path. He took photos every few days, measuring its growth, sending them to a few online friends from the farming forum. They replied with astonishment. "You've got a record on your hands," one man wrote. Another said, "Looks like you'll make the county fair for sure." The praise made him proud, but also uneasy. There was something strange about the plant. The air around it always felt a little heavier, as if it held more moisture or static. When he knelt close to weed the soil, he noticed a faint metallic scent, like hot wires after a storm. His dog, Rusty, who used to follow him everywhere, began to avoid that part of the yard. The dog would whine if Thomas lingered there too long. Even the bees that buzzed over his cucumber patch seemed to circle wide around the pumpkin vines. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe the fertilizer, maybe the weather. The region had been hit by heat waves lately. Still, he couldn't help noticing how fast it grew. Each day it seemed to double in size. By midsummer, the pumpkin itself was the size of a tire. 2 weeks later, it was the size of a washing machine. He started getting visits from neighbors, curious to see the monster. Old Mr. Collins from down the road laughed when he saw it. "You'll need a crane to lift that thing to the fair, Tom," he said, slapping his knee. Thomas smiled, but the joke didn't sit right. At night, he sometimes went out with a flashlight to check on it. The plant looked almost alive in the dark. Its leaves had a sheen to them, and when the wind moved through, they seemed to quiver on their own. Once, he thought he saw them pulse faintly like breathing. He told himself he was imagining things. The grief, the heat, the isolation, it all played tricks on the mind. By late August, the pumpkin had reached a size that defied reason. It was nearly 5 feet across, its skin smooth and cold, like polished stone. The vine that connected it to the earth was thicker than his wrist. The ground beneath it had turned a darker color, almost black, and the grass surrounding it had withered away. When it rained, the water that pooled near the pumpkin smelled odd sweet and metallic. One morning, he noticed a crack in its side. A thin, jagged line ran across the surface like a scar. From it leaked a translucent fluid, thicker than sap. The air filled with an acrid smell, something between ozone and chlorine. He crouched beside it, squinting. The fluid shimmered faintly under the light. When a drop touched his boot, it left a dull mark on the rubber. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he took a small knife and carefully cut off a piece of the rind, maybe an inch thick. It was heavier than he expected. The flesh inside wasn't orange. It was grayish-white, with fibers that seemed to glisten. The smell was harsh, chemical. He tried to wash his knife, but the metal dulled almost instantly, leaving a cloudy film across the blade. That evening, uneasy, he packed a sample in a plastic bag and mailed it to a lab at the State Agricultural College. He included a short note. "Suspected soil contamination or mutation. Please advise." Then he waited. 2 days later, a white van appeared on the road leading to his farm. It stopped by the gate, and 4 people stepped out, dressed in full protective suits with reflective visors. They didn't knock. They didn't ask permission. They walked straight to the field. One of them handed Thomas a folded paper with an official seal. Department of Agricultural Safety, authorized inspection. His mouth went dry. He tried to ask what was going on, but they ignored him. They set up yellow barriers around the patch, took photos, collected soil, and sliced open the pumpkin with tools that looked more suited for surgery than farming. The smell that poured out was unbearable, like burnt plastic mixed with sulfur. One of them muttered, "Same pattern as Hale County," before realizing Thomas was within earshot. Another said sharply, "No external communication." By nightfall, they were still there, setting up lights that bathed the field in cold white glare. Thomas watched from his porch, helpless. They poured liquid from metal canisters over the vines, and smoke began to rise. The pumpkin burned with a strange blue flame that hissed instead of crackled. The wind carried a sweet, toxic smell across the yard. Thomas felt something in his chest collapse. It wasn't just a plant. It had been his attempt to feel alive again, his tribute to Linda. Now men in suits were burning it like garbage, and he wasn't even allowed to ask why. He wanted to shout, but his voice failed. When the fire died down, one of the inspectors turned to him. Behind the visor, his voice was muffled, but calm. "The area is now under quarantine. Please remain off this land until further notice. Soil remediation may take several months." Thomas could only nod. He didn't understand half of what they were saying. Another man spoke into his radio. "Case confirmation. Pattern consistent with hail distribution. Containment successful." The next morning, the field was nothing but a black scar. The grass was gone. The soil cracked like burned clay. The smell of chemicals hung in the air, seeping into his clothes, his hair, his skin. In the local newspaper, a single paragraph appeared under the small heading, "Agricultural Safety Incident." It read, "Local authorities confirmed a minor chemical contamination on private farmland outside of Brookfield County. Officials say there is no risk to residents." That was all. No mention of the pumpkin. No mention of the men in suits. Thomas sat on his porch, looking out at the smoldering field. The morning sun rose behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dead earth. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been erased, not just from his land, but from the world's memory. The pumpkin was gone, yet its smell still lingered, faint and bitter. He took a long breath and muttered, "What the hell did I plant?" Somewhere under the burned soil, a seed still slept. The morning after the fire, Thomas woke to the smell of chemicals that still lingered in the air. It was as if the smoke had sunk into the very bones of the house. His clothes smelled of it, his hair too, and no matter how long he left the windows open, the wind only brought more of that sour, metallic scent from the blackened field. The grass around the porch had turned gray overnight. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. He sat for hours, staring at the charred soil that had once been his garden, trying to find a shape, a trace of what was left of the pumpkin. But there was nothing. When he finally stepped off the porch, his boots left faint prints on the cracked surface. The ground felt strangely brittle, as if the top layer had been scorched into glass. He crouched and picked up a handful of earth, but it slipped through his fingers like dust. Nothing alive remained there, not a worm, not a root. He thought of the men in their white suits, of the words they had said. Containment successful. It hadn't sounded like something meant for the public. It sounded like something meant to hide. By noon, a truck pulled up on the dirt road, and two men in plain clothes stepped out. They handed him a notice. The property was now under temporary agricultural quarantine for soil remediation. He wasn't allowed to till, plant, or enter the area for an unspecified period. When he tried to ask questions, one of the men just said, "For your own safety, Mr. Lane." Then they drove away. For the next few days, Thomas felt like a ghost haunting his own land. He wandered the edges of the field, careful not to cross the yellow tape they had left behind. Every night, the wind carried that faint chemical tang, and sometimes, if he listened long enough, he thought he could hear a low hum coming from beneath the ground, a vibration, more felt than heard. He told himself it was just the wind through the burnt stalks. A week later, he saw the first headline in the Brookfield Herald. Minor chemical incident contained. No risk to locals. Beneath it, a single photo showed a field of smoke and a caption that read, "Authorities neutralize contamination on private farm." That was it. No names, no explanations. The article might as well have been about a spilled barrel of fertilizer. He didn't leave the house for days after that. He stopped answering calls, even from the few neighbors who had once come by to see the giant pumpkin. Some had started whispering that he had used illegal chemicals or burned his own field for insurance. When he passed through town to buy supplies, people looked away or changed the subject. By the end of the month, he was eating out of cans, sleeping in a chair by the window, keeping watch over a field that would never grow again. Then, one morning, the mail came. Amid the usual bills and flyers, there was an unmarked envelope, no return address, just his name typed neatly in black ink. Inside was a single piece of paper. No message, no greeting. Only 2 short lines written in pencil. You are not the first. Hale Distribution. Below the words was a small clipping from an old newspaper article, yellowed and creased. The headline read, "Farm contamination leads to death of livestock in Hale County." The date was 2 years old. The article mentioned a rare soil infection linked to experimental crops, and at the bottom, a name leapt out at him. Evil Gen Research. The name stirred something in his memory. He had seen it once before, on one of the storage crates in the hands of the men who had burned his pumpkin. He remembered the dark letters printed on white plastic, and how one of the workers had covered them with his glove when he noticed Thomas looking. He didn't think. He packed a small bag, grabbed his truck keys, and drove off. The old Chevy coughed to life, spitting dust behind it as he turned toward the highway. The address on the original seed package had said Hale Distribution, Route 7, Elroy County. It was a 2-hour drive west. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. There was no one left to tell. By the time he reached the county line, the sun was setting, and the landscape had turned into long stretches of red dirt and telephone poles. The road narrowed, then broke into gravel. He found the turn marked Route 7, but there was no sign of a working business, only a row of derelict warehouses, their roofs caved in, windows broken, doors rusted. He parked and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. The building with the faded sign Hale Distribution looked abandoned for years. But when he pushed the door, it gave way easily, hinges groaning. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of oil. There were shelves of old metal crates, most stamped with serial numbers. He moved through the darkness with his flashlight, the beam cutting across broken lab equipment. Flasks, microscopes, even what looked like freezers bolted to the floor. The further he went, the clearer it became that this hadn't been a warehouse at all. It was a laboratory. On one of the tables lay a binder. He opened it and saw printed charts, growth rates, genetic data, soil adaptation metrics. Across the top of every page was the same header: Project Gen Harvest, Phase 3. The language was technical, but one note in the margin stood out. Unexpected toxicity in mammalian subjects. Containment protocols enacted. Another page described a property of recombinant regeneration. Plants capable of surviving in chemically contaminated soil by metabolizing heavy metals. There was a photo attached, a vine with enormous leaves, almost identical to the one he had grown. A chill crept down his spine. It was all their dates, signatures, the company's name. Evil Gen Research had been behind it. They had created those seeds. And somehow, their experiments had found their way into his hands. He searched the rest of the building. Most of the equipment had been dismantled, but near the back room, he found an old computer tower, still plugged into a wall outlet. When he pressed the power button, the screen flickered, then displayed a login prompt. To his surprise, it bypassed the password and opened automatically into a single folder labeled Reports. The latest file was dated 2 years ago. It read, Hale Site Termination. Assets liquidated. The report described the shutdown of several testing fields after public exposure incidents and the relocation of personnel to private sector partnerships. One line caught his eye. Remaining seed stock distributed through non-governmental channels to prevent traceability. He didn't need to be a lawyer to understand what that meant. They had sold the dangerous seeds under fake labels to make them disappear. And one of those packets had ended up in his garden. By the time he left the building, Night had fallen completely. He sat in his truck for a long while, staring at the dark shape of the warehouse through the windshield. He felt sick. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from anger, the quiet, deep kind that builds like a storm inside. They had known exactly what they were doing. They had used men like him, ordinary farmers, as their cover. On the drive home, the radio was full of static. Every time he thought he heard a song, it dissolved into crackling noise. The road seemed endless, and the headlights carved tunnels of light through the dust. When he finally reached his farm, the sky was already pale with dawn. He parked the truck, shut the engine, and sat there, listening to the faint hum that still seemed to come from the soil. The next day, he called the county agricultural office. The woman on the line transferred him 3 times before a man finally spoke. Thomas told him everything: the seed packet, the men in suits, the warehouse. The man listened in silence, and then said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Lane, but Hale Distribution has been defunct for over 2 years. There's nothing on record under that name." When Thomas pressed him about Evil-Gen, the man's tone changed. "That information is classified under federal review. My advice? Let it go, for your own safety." Then the line went dead. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at the silent phone. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. Outside, the field shimmered under the afternoon heat, like a sheet of glass. He couldn't let it go. Not when he knew there were others, like him, other farmers, who had planted the same cursed seeds, maybe burned down the same way. He found the name of a journalist in a local paper, Clara Holt. She had written several articles on environmental corruption and small-town contamination cases. He wrote her an email explaining everything, attaching the photos from the warehouse, the notes he had taken, and the report he had printed out. For days, there was no reply. He began to think she had dismissed him as another crazy old farmer. Then, one afternoon, her car pulled into his driveway. She stepped out, a thin woman in her 30s, with tired eyes and a leather notebook tucked under her arm. "Mr. Lane?" she asked, looking wary. "You're the one who sent me the message about Evil-Gen?" He nodded. She looked past him toward the blackened field. "Mind if I take a look?" They walked together to the edge of the ash. She knelt, scooped a bit of the soil into a plastic vial, and sniffed the air. "It's still active," she murmured. "That's not just pesticide residue." She stood up, brushing her hands. "You weren't lying." Over coffee, he told her everything: how the pumpkin had grown, the glow at night, the smell, the suits, the fire. She listened without interrupting, only scribbling notes. When he handed her the documents from the warehouse, she froze. "I've seen this name before," she said quietly. "Evil-Gen. They went bankrupt 5 years ago after a contamination scandal. Only now it seems they didn't really shut down. They just changed faces." Clara sent samples to an independent lab she trusted. A week later, she called him back, her voice trembling with excitement and dread. "Thomas," she said, "the results show traces of synthetic metal-binding compounds and gene fragments used in bioengineered remediation plants. It's military-grade tech. This isn't farming science, it's defense research." He didn't sleep that night. The idea that his small patch of land had been turned into a testing ground for someone's experiment made his stomach turn. Clara kept digging. Through old records, she found that the same warehouse address had been linked to several shell companies, each tied to former Evil-Gen executives. They had taken the old project, renamed it Gen Harvest, and begun selling off the results through back channels. A few days later, Clara's first article came out. "The pumpkin that burned a farm, tracing the hidden roots of Evil-Gen." It was a local story, but it spread fast. The photo of Thomas's field gray and cracked appeared on social media, with captions like, What are they hiding? And when science goes wrong. That night, Thomas's phone rang. A man's voice, calm and measured, spoke on the other end. "You've made a mistake, Mr. Lane. This isn't your fight." Thomas's hand tightened on the receiver. "You burned my land," he said quietly. "I think it is." There was a pause. Then the man said, "Some things are better left buried," and hung up. The next morning, Thomas found his old tractor burned in the barn. The flames had eaten it down to a shell of black metal. The sheriff came, took notes, and left without saying much. "Probably a wiring issue," he said. But the look in his eyes said he didn't believe it either. Clara kept pushing forward. She uncovered financial records linking Evil-Gen's remaining assets to a large agricultural conglomerate that had recently acquired government contracts for soil restoration projects. The same compounds found in Thomas's soil appeared in several other contamination reports across the state. The pattern was clear. They had buried their failed experiments in plain sight, selling their mistakes as miracles. Late one night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the newspaper open in front of him. Clara's second article was already in print, naming names, citing documents, demanding accountability. He felt a strange mix of pride and fear. He knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, others were still planting those same poisoned seeds, still believing they were growing something beautiful. He looked out the window toward the field. In the moonlight, the ground seemed to shimmer faintly, as if reflecting something beneath the surface. He couldn't tell if it was his imagination or not. The ash had settled, but the earth was still restless, like a living thing holding its breath. The hum returned that night, deep and rhythmic, pulsing through the floorboards. He sat awake until dawn, listening, wondering if it was coming from under the ground or from inside his own heart. The world changed slowly, as if reluctant to wake. When Clara's second article reached the state papers, it spread like fire through dry grass. News crews began arriving in Brookfield, their vans parked along the road near Thomas's farm, cameras pointed at the blackened earth that once held the monstrous pumpkin. He had never been the kind of man who liked attention, but now the whole country seemed to know his name. To them, he wasn't Thomas Lane, the quiet widower who'd lost his wife and half his crops. He was the farmer who grew a secret weapon. It sounded absurd, even to him. Yet, as the days passed and the headlines multiplied, he understood that absurdity was exactly how truth survived. It hid behind disbelief. Clara came almost every day. She was tired, overworked, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that reminded him of the days when he'd first planted those seeds. Hope mixed with purpose. She told him that government agencies had reopened old investigations, that Evil-Gen's files were now public record. What they revealed was worse than either of them had imagined. The company had conducted dozens of unauthorized tests across the country, creating plants designed to neutralize industrial toxins, only to discover that the process made the crops themselves poisonous. When the experiments were shut down, instead of destroying the materials, Evil-Gen's executives had sold them through private distributors. Hale Distribution was just one of many. Soon, hearings began. Thomas was called to testify before a congressional committee in the state capitol. He had never been inside a courthouse before, and when he stood under the fluorescent lights, facing rows of suited men and women with pens poised above notepads, he felt as though he had wandered into someone else's story. He spoke plainly, without rehearsed lines. He told them about the seed advertisement, about the pumpkin's unnatural growth, the smell, the fire, the men in protective suits. He showed them the photographs from Clara's report, the blackened soil, the warehouse at Hale Distribution, the binder marked Gen Harvest. His voice trembled at times, but he didn't try to hide it. When he finished, the room was silent. One of the officials, a woman with gray hair and glasses that caught the light, asked, "Mr. Lane, did you understand that what you planted was genetically altered material?" He shook his head. "I thought it was just a pumpkin. I was trying to grow something my wife loved." Another man leaned forward. "And when you realized it wasn't natural?" Thomas met his gaze. "I didn't realize until they burned it. But by then, it was too late. You could smell it in the air, feel it in the soil. It wasn't just dead. It was angry." The phrase unsettled them. He could see it in the way the stenographer hesitated before typing it. Angry soil. But he meant it. There was something in that land that had felt alive even after it was destroyed, something that didn't belong to any season or science. After the hearing, the press surrounded him. Microphones appeared from all directions, voices shouting questions. "Do you think there are more contaminated farms? Are you planning to sue? Do you blame the government?" Thomas answered none of them. He pushed through the crowd until he found Clara waiting by her car. She handed him a cup of coffee and said, "You did good." He smiled weakly. "I didn't do anything but tell the truth." "That's more than most people do," she said. The next few months were a blur. The Evil Gen scandal became a national conversation. Executives were arrested. Politicians promised reforms. Farmers across the Midwest began testing their soil, some discovering the same traces of synthetic compounds found on Thomas's land. There were lawsuits, protests, television debates. Environmental groups held rallies, waving signs that read, "Seeds of greed, and we won't eat what we can't name." Clara's articles were quoted in congressional reports. Her name appeared beside his in major magazines. She hated the attention as much as he did, but neither of them could step away now. The government eventually declared Thomas's property a restricted environmental site. Fences went up, warning signs were posted, and hazmat crews returned to conduct tests. They confirmed what he already knew. The soil was still toxic. Nothing could be planted there for years. Officials spoke of reclamation programs, of funding and partnerships, but Thomas stopped listening after a while. The words meant nothing to him. He didn't want money or recognition. He wanted the sound of the wind moving through real grass again, the smell of clean earth after rain, the sight of something growing because it was meant to. In time, the public's attention faded. New scandals replaced the old. Reporters stopped calling. The field was left alone. It took another 2 years before a small, non-profit environmental group arrived, offering to restore the area as a memorial park. They called it the Renewal Project. The plan was to plant trees species known for their resilience, trees that could absorb what the soil still held and slowly heal it. Thomas agreed, though he didn't join the ceremony. He watched from his porch as volunteers in green shirts dug holes and placed saplings in the ground. When they finished, they erected a simple wooden sign near the road. It read, "Here grew what was never meant to grow. Let the land remember, and let it heal." Clara attended that day, camera hanging from her neck. After the volunteers left, she walked up the porch steps and sat beside him. "They want to name the grove after you," she said. He shook his head. "No, name it after the land. It did all the suffering." She smiled faintly. "You really think it can heal?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the young trees stood in neat rows against the evening light. Everything heals, given time. But it never forgets. They sat in silence as the sky darkened. The air smelled cleaner now, touched by the faint sweetness of new leaves. When Clara left, she squeezed his shoulder and said, "You'll see. Something good will come of this." He wanted to believe her. Years passed quietly. The grove grew dense and green. Birds returned, then rabbits, then deer. The land that once hissed and burned began to breathe again. Thomas aged, his hair turning the same color as the ash that had once covered his fields. He still lived in the same house, tending small patches of vegetables in a greenhouse he built beside the porch. He didn't plant pumpkins anymore. Sometimes on late afternoons, he would sit with a cup of tea and listen to the rustle of the trees, the wind whispering through them like distant voices. People still came from time to time. Students writing reports, environmental activists, journalists searching for a forgotten story. They called his land the place where truth sprouted. He always found that phrase ironic. To him, truth hadn't sprouted. It had been dug up like a grave. One spring morning, while inspecting the outer fence of the grove, Thomas noticed something strange. Near the ditch that marked the boundary of his property, where the restoration zone ended and his neighbor's field began, a small patch of earth looked disturbed. The soil was darker, softer, as if recently turned. He crouched and brushed away the loose dirt. A single green shoot pushed through, its leaves small but glossy. When sunlight touched them, they glinted faintly, almost metallic. He froze. The shape of the leaves, their width, the texture of the veins, it was all too familiar. He reached out, then pulled his hand back, as if the air around the plant carried heat. His first thought was denial. It couldn't be. The seeds had been destroyed, the soil sterilized, the area monitored. Yet here it was, alive, defiant, and impossibly clean against the rough dirt. He stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his sleeves. For a moment he thought of calling someone Clara, perhaps, or one of the scientists. But then he stopped himself. What would they do? Burn it again? Lock the land under another fence? He stared at the tiny plant and felt a strange calm settle over him. This time he wasn't angry or afraid. There was something inevitable about it, something that made sense in a way no report ever could. The land wasn't done speaking. By dusk, he was still there. The air cooled, and a faint mist rolled in from the creek. The young trees of the grove swayed softly, their leaves whispering in unison. The shoot seemed to glow in the fading light, not with the toxic brilliance he remembered, but with a quiet, steady gleam. It looked like any other sprout to an untrained eye, yet he knew better. He could almost hear Linda's voice in the wind, gentle and knowing, as if she too had accepted that some things were beyond control. That night, he sat by the window, with the lamp turned low. The reflection of the field shimmered on the glass. He thought about all the years that had passed, the fire, the hearings, the cameras, the promises. So much noise, and yet, in the end, the world had gone back to sleep, leaving only the land to remember. He smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of understanding. When morning came, he walked out to the fence again. The sprout was still there, a little taller now, its leaves reaching toward the sky. Dew clung to its surface, and for a moment he saw the reflection of the sunrise in it, a flash of gold, then green, then silver. He whispered quietly, "You found your way back." He didn't tell anyone. He didn't pull it out or cover it. He simply let it be. Some seeds, he thought, belong to the world more than to men. And though they might have been born from mistakes, they still carried the stubborn will to live. As the years continued to turn, the grove around it grew thicker, stronger, more vibrant. Visitors came and went, reading the plaque, taking pictures, walking through the paths lined with young oaks. None of them noticed the small patch by the fence where something older, stranger, and more persistent had taken root. Thomas never moved away. He lived to see the grove become a full-grown forest. And when people asked him, sometimes at town meetings or in letters, what lesson he had learned from it all, he always gave the same answer. You can win a trial, you can change a law, but you can't bargain with the earth. It remembers everything, On the last spring he lived to see, the air over the field was alive again, with the hum of insects and the shimmer of heat. From his porch, the horizon looked whole, healed. Only he knew that beneath one corner of it, something ancient and forbidden still pulsed quietly, like a heartbeat, deep in the soil. The world had moved on. The headlines had faded. But life never stopped trying. And when the wind swept through the grove at dusk, it carried a scent faintly metallic, faintly sweet, and in that scent, if one listened closely enough, there was a whisper that seemed to say that the story wasn't over. The land, like all living things, had its own memory, and some memories were too deeply rooted ever to die. If you want more true and powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Watch the next story, and share this video so more people can see it.